The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a boy whose bicycle chain groaned as if in protest against the very air of the rundown street. Nathaniel Nate Crow, once a name whispered with respect in the hallowed, smoke-filled halls of the Pinkerton Agency, now occupied a stained armchair in a Chicago flat, a tumbler of cheap rye his only confidant. The boy, wary of the stale, boozy scent that clung to the building, dropped the yellow envelope onto the scuffed floorboards and fled. Nate watched it lay there, an anachronism in his self-imposed exile. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has seen too much, that no good news ever arrived via telegram. He let it sit for a full hour, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a relic from a life he'd actively dismantled, mocking his feigned indifference. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every unsolved case, he reached for it. The words blurred at first, a cruel trick of his whiskey-addled eyes. But then they solidified, each character a tiny hammer blow against the fragile piece he'd constructed. Urgent, child missing, Morehouse, Villisca, come at once, Elias Thorne, sheriff. Nate's hand trembled, nearly tearing the brittle paper. Morehouse, Villisca. The names were like a brand, seared into his memory. The summer of 1912, the stifling heat, the sickening sweetness of blood and fear that had permeated every pore of that cursed house. He'd walked into a nightmare, a seasoned investigator brought to his knees by the sheer, senseless brutality of it all. 8 souls, 2 adults, 6 children, slaughtered in their sleep. No forced entry, no clear motive, just an axe, a kerosene lamp, and a terror that had echoed through the nation. He had failed, and that failure had cost him everything. He took a long, burning swallow of rye, the liquid doing little to extinguish the cold dread blooming in his gut. His eyes scanned the telegram again, falling upon the last line, scribbled hastily, almost an afterthought, yet more potent than any formal plea. Nate, the mirrors in the girl's room are covered. He's back. The tumbler slipped from his grasp, shattering against the floor. The sound, sharp and final, was a punctuation mark on the end of his quiet, ruined life. He was going back to Villisca. The train journey was a blur of passing cornfields, each stalk a silent sentinel bearing witness to his reluctant pilgrimage. Villisca, when he finally stepped onto its dusty platform, was a ghost of the town he remembered. The vibrant hum of a thriving farming community had been replaced by a pervasive, almost palpable silence. Windows were shuttered, porch swings creaked emptily in the dry wind, and the few townsfolk he saw moved with a furtive, haunted air, their eyes darting, suspicious. Elias Thorne, older now, his face etched with lines of worry, was waiting for him. He was no longer the eager, fresh-faced deputy Nate had known, but a man burdened by an invisible weight. His uniform, though clean, seemed to hang loosely on his frame. "Nate," Elias greeted, his voice hoarse. "I knew you'd come." Nate merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over the deserted platform. "What's happened, Elias?" he asked, his voice gravelly from disuse. "It's Sarah Jenkins. Her family just moved into the Morehouse. Desperate, you know. Nowhere else to go." Elias wrung his hands, his eyes pleading. "They moved in 2 weeks ago. Last night, Sarah disappeared from her bed. Just gone. Like they were." "The mirrors," Nate stated, "not a question." Elias flinched. Every single one in her room, covered, just like the Moore children's faces that night. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air snaked down Nate's spine. It was the same meticulous, almost ritualistic covering of faces and mirrors, a detail that had baffled him and his Pinkerton colleagues for months. It wasn't about concealment. It was about something else. Something deeper, more sinister. "Tell me everything," Nate commanded, the old detective resurfacing, a flicker of the man he once was. As they drove through the darkening streets of Villisca, Elias recounted the sparse details. The Jenkins family, heartbroken and terrified. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. Just an empty bed and the covered mirrors. The town, already on edge for years, was now gripped by a fear so profound it bordered on hysteria. Whispers of the Villisca curse had spread like wildfire. The Moore house stood at the edge of town, a dark skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It was larger than Nate remembered, more imposing, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world with an ancient, unblinking malice. The once manicured lawn was overgrown, weeds clinging to the porch like grasping fingers. A for sale sign, weather-beaten and faded, leaned precariously in the tall grass, a cruel joke. "No one's bought it," Elias murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Not after what happened. Not after everything." Inside, the air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of decay, a testament to years of neglect. The furniture, covered in white sheets, stood like ghostly figures, silent witnesses to unspeakable horrors. The very floorboards seemed to groan under their weight, as if remembering the footsteps of the dead. Nate moved with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning every detail, every shadow. The old instincts, dulled by alcohol and despair, began to stir. He noted the way the dust lay undisturbed on certain surfaces, indicating no recent passage. He examined the windows, the locks. Nothing disturbed. It was as if Sarah had simply dissolved. They reached Sarah's bedroom. The room was small, decorated with the simple, innocent touches of a child. A rag doll slumped in a corner, a half-finished drawing on a small wooden table. But it was the mirrors that drew Nate's gaze. A trio of them, a small dressing mirror, a cheval mirror, and a wall-mounted one, all neatly covered with dark cloths, a meticulous hand at work. "Where's her family?" Nate asked, his voice tight. "At the church," Elias replied, his gaze fixed on the covered mirrors as if expecting them to peel away and reveal something horrifying. "Pastor Davies is with them. They're beside themselves." Nate walked to the covered cheval mirror, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric. The cold emanating from it was unnatural, a deeper chill than the mere absence of heat. He had felt this cold before, on that terrible night in 1912. It was the cold of a tomb. "This wasn't a random act, Elias," Nate said, his voice flat. "This was planned. Someone wanted to send a message. Or recreate something." Elias nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "The town's talking about a curse. About the man from the train. They say he's returned." Nate scoffed, a bitter sound. "Superstition. There's always a human hand behind evil. Elias." He believed that, or at least he used to. The Villisca murders had challenged that conviction in a way nothing else ever had. The illogicality of it, the sheer unbridled savagery with no apparent motive, had gnawed at his logical mind, leaving it a hollowed-out shell. "Maybe," Elias said, his eyes avoiding Nate's. "But you weren't here, Nate, these past few years. You didn't see the fear. It's changed this town, turned us against each other." As they descended the creaking staircase, a thought struck Nate. Did anyone see anything? A stranger? Anyone new in town? Elias hesitated, his hand on the banister. "No one knew, not really. But Judge Miller, he's been acting strange, more secretive than usual." Judge Miller. The name resonated with Nate. A powerful, respected man in Villisca, a pillar of the community. Nate remembered him from the original investigation. a man of quiet authority, almost too composed. Miller? Nate raised an eyebrow. What about him? He's been holding these meetings, Elias mumbled, looking away. Late at night, at his estate. Only certain people, the old families, the founders. A prickle of suspicion, cold and sharp, began to form in Nate's mind. A conspiracy in Villisca? It seemed far-fetched, yet the pieces, disparate as they were, began to align in a disturbing way. The covered mirrors, the absence of struggle, the carefully chosen victim, and now the whispers of secret meetings. "Take me to the judge," Nate said, his eyes narrowed. Now, Judge Miller's estate was a stark contrast to the decaying Moore house. Grand and imposing, it sat atop a slight rise, illuminated by gas lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. Nate felt an instant aversion to the place, an intuitive sense of wrongness. Miller himself greeted them at the door, a tall, imposing man with a perfectly tailored suit and eyes that, despite their age, missed nothing. He offered a polite but cool welcome, his gaze lingering on Nate with an unnerving intensity. "Mr. Crow," Miller said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "A surprise to see you back in Villisca, though, given the circumstances, perhaps not." "Judge," Nate replied, his tone equally devoid of warmth. "I hear you've been holding meetings. The town's abuzz." Miller's lips twitched in a faint, unreadable smile. "Community concerns, Mr. Crow. The drought, the missing child. These are difficult times. We gather to discuss ways to support each other, to pray for our town's salvation." Nate's gaze flickered to Elias, who stood stiffly beside him, avoiding eye contact. Elias, the loyal subordinate, now seemed like a stranger. The unease grew. "Salvation?" Nate pressed. "From what, exactly?" "From a lingering shadow, Mr. Crow," Miller said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "A darkness that has clung to Villisca since that terrible night. Some of us believe the original events were not random, but a cleansing, a sacrifice to restore balance." Nate felt a jolt of alarm. "A sacrifice? For prosperity?" Miller simply smiled, a chilling, knowing expression. "The years following the murders were bountiful, Mr. Crow. Villisca prospered. And now, with the drought, with the return of this darkness, some believe it's time to appease the forces that govern our fate." The implication hung in the air, thick and repulsive. Miller and his council reinterpreting an act of brutal murder as a ritualistic cleansing. And now, with Sarah missing, they intended to repeat it. "Where is Sarah, Judge?" Nate demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Miller's eyes, cold and unwavering, met his. "I have no knowledge of the girl's whereabouts, Mr. Crow. I am merely a concerned citizen." He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand. "Perhaps you should look elsewhere." The conversation was a dance of veiled threats and unsettling suggestions. Nate knew he was being toyed with, but he also knew Miller wouldn't break easily. He excused himself and Elias, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions as they walked back to the sheriff's office. "What was that about, Elias?" Nate finally asked, turning on his old protege. "What's going on with Miller and his council?" Elias hesitated, his face a mask of internal conflict. "He's a powerful man, Nate. The founders, they believe in the old ways." "Old ways?" Nate scoffed. "Sacrificing children is an old way?" Elias flinched. "It's not like that, Nate. He convinced them, convinced me, that it's the only way to save Villisca. To save my boy." Nate stopped dead in his tracks. "Your boy? What are you talking about?" Tears welled in Elias's eyes, a dam breaking. "My son Thomas. He's sick, Nate. A terrible fever. The doctors, they say there's no hope. Miller, he told me the drought, the sickness, it's all a sign. That the cleansing wasn't completed. That if we perform another, then the town will heal. Thomas will heal. The truth hit Nate with the force of a physical blow. Elias, his trusted subordinate, a desperate father, manipulated and drawn into a dark conspiracy. His call for help hadn't been entirely genuine. It had been a plea, yes, but also a diversion. To buy time. You brought me here to stall me, didn't you, Elias? Nate's voice was devoid of emotion, a cold, hard accusation. Elias averted his gaze, shame etched on his face. He said you'd interfere, that you'd stop it. I just want to save my son, Nate. And you think sacrificing an innocent girl will save him? Nate grabbed Elias by the lapels, shaking him. You, a lawman, believe in this madness? It's desperation, Nate. Elias cried, tears streaming down his face. What else am I to do? Nate released him, disgusted but also seeing the agonizing pain in Elias's eyes. It was the desperation of a man pushed to the edge, vulnerable to the sinister promises of a charismatic monster. Where is she, Elias? Nate demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Where are they taking Sarah? Elias hesitated, looking around as if fearing unseen eyes. The Moore house, the attic. Tonight, they're reenacting it. The attic, of course. The very place where the Moore family, the parents, had been found. The ultimate desecration. We have to go, Nate said, already turning towards the path to the Moore house. No, Nate, you can't. Elias grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. It's too dangerous. They'll be ready for you. They'll stop you. Then you stay here, Nate snapped, shaking off his hand. I'm going. Elias looked at him, his face a canvas of agony. I can't let you go alone. I'm a part of this, Nate. I have to try and fix it. Nate stared at his old friend, a flicker of the man he once knew shining through the desperation. Then let's go, he said, and together they plunged into the encroaching darkness. The Moore house, under the pall of night, was a different beast altogether. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the broken panes, seemed magnified, imbued with a malicious sentience. The air inside was heavier now, not just with dust and decay, but with a palpable sense of dread. They moved through the silent house, Nate's senses on high alert. He could feel it, the creeping cold, the unnerving silence that was deeper than mere quiet. It was the presence of something truly ancient, truly malevolent. The man from the train, Elias had called it. Nate still clung to his logical mind, but the cold, the inexplicable fear, chipped away at his convictions. As they ascended the final flight of narrow, creaking stairs to the attic, hushed voices became audible, a low chanting punctuated by Judge Miller's resonant tones. Nate exchanged a grim look with Elias. They were too late to prevent the start of the ritual. Nate pushed open the attic door, and the scene that unfolded before him was a tableau of chilling horror. The attic, stifling and hot despite the lingering chill, was dimly lit by a single kerosene lantern, casting grotesque shadows that danced like specters. In the center, on a makeshift altar fashioned from stacked crates and covered with a dark cloth, lay Sarah. Her eyes were wide with terror, a gag in her mouth, her small body bound. Around her, Judge Miller stood, his face illuminated by the flickering light, his eyes gleaming with a fanatic zeal. He was surrounded by a dozen or so men and women, the elders of Villisca, their faces grim and resolute, their eyes reflecting a terrifying conviction. They were chanting, a guttural, archaic sound that seemed to vibrate through Nate's bones. Miller held an axe, identical in shape and size to the one used in the original murders. It was poised, glinting ominously in the lamplight. "The cleansing must be completed." Miller's voice boomed, echoing off the low ceiling. "The blood of the innocent will restore our bounty. The shadow will be appeased." Nate burst into the room, a roar tearing from his throat. "Stop this madness!" All eyes turned to him, startled. Miller's face contorted in a sneer. "Crow, you interfere again. You seek to deny us our salvation." Before anyone could react, Elias, his face streaked with tears and determination, lunged forward. "No!" he cried, tackling one of the cult members who was moving towards Nate. "This isn't salvation, it's murder." The attic erupted into chaos. Nate, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, moved with a speed and ferocity that belied his years and his recent struggles. He dodged a wild swing from one of Miller's followers, delivering a swift, brutal punch that sent the man sprawling. He had been a Pinkerton, a fighter, and the instincts were flooding back. Miller, abandoning his ritual for a moment, turned his axe towards Nate. "You will not stop us, old man. The darkness demands its due." As Nate fought, a new, more profound cold began to seep into the oppressive heat of the attic. The air grew heavy, almost solid, and the shadows seemed to deepen, to take on a life of their own. A strange, unnatural silence fell over the chaotic scene, a silence that swallowed sounds rather than merely lacking them. Then, from the darkest corner of the attic, a shape began to coalesce. Taller than any man, impossibly thin, a silhouette against the dim light. It wore the indistinct clothing of a traveler, a fedora pulled low over a face that remained forever shrouded in impenetrable shadow. In its hand, it carried an axe, not a tool, but an extension of its own gaunt form. "The man from the train," Elias gasped, his face ashen, pointing a trembling finger. The entity glided forward, moving with an eerie, noiseless grace. It did not speak, did not make a sound, yet its presence was a scream. A wave of intense paranoia washed over everyone in the room. The cult members, momentarily forgetting Nate, began to eye each other with suspicion, their chants faltering. Judge Miller, though, seemed to recognize it, his eyes widening not with fear, but with a terrifying reverence. "It has come," Miller whispered, his voice trembling with a perverse sense of triumph. "The sacrifice will be accepted." But the man from the train paid no mind to Miller or his cult. Its shadowy gaze seemed to fix on Sarah, then on Nate, then on the very act of violence unfolding. It was not there for the ritual. It was there because it was the ritual. It was the lingering horror, the embodiment of the unspeakable. A desperate, three-sided battle erupted. Nate fought to reach Sarah, fending off the panicked cult members and Judge Miller's desperate swings. Miller and his remaining cultists, in their deluded zeal, tried to complete the ritual, believing the entity to be an affirmation of their purpose. And the man from the train, drawn by the echoes of violence, moved through the room like a cold draft, its axe a silent, terrifying extension of its will, striking indiscriminately at anyone caught in its path. One of the cult members, caught in a moment of panic, stumbled into its path. The axe swung noiselessly, and the man crumpled, a silent horror in the oppressive quiet. This was not a spirit seeking revenge. It was a force of nature, a monstrous echo of the original crime, seeking only to complete its cycle. Nate dodged Miller's axe, a desperate parry with his forearm. He saw the entity glide towards Sarah, its shadowy axe raised. There was no time. Logic, his lifelong companion, screamed at him to find a weapon, to fight. But what weapon could fight a shadow? Then, a sudden realization struck him. a flash of insight born of desperation. The covered mirrors, the silent movement, the paranoia it induced. It was not a physical being. It was a manifestation of darkness, of secrecy, of fear. You couldn't fight a shadow with a fist. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning frantically. The single kerosene lantern cast its feeble light. And then he remembered the covered mirrors in Sarah's room downstairs, and how they had covered the victims' faces upstairs. A symbol of concealment, of hiding from the truth. "The light!" Nate yelled, his voice hoarse. "It's the light and the truth!" He lunged towards the single kerosene lantern, swatting away a cult member. With a desperate heave, he smashed the lantern against the wall. The room was plunged into absolute darkness, a terrifying, suffocating blackness. Panic erupted among the cultists. Miller roared in frustration and confusion. Elias, who had been fighting valiantly, called out Nate's name. But Nate wasn't done. He scrambled in the darkness, feeling for the heavy cloths that covered the mirrors in the main part of the attic, the ones that had been placed there since the original murders. He found one, then another, his hands tearing at the fabric. He pulled them down, one by one. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a box of matches, and with a trembling hand, struck one. The sudden flare of the match illuminated the room for a split second, revealing the horrified faces of the cultists, the bewildered Miller, and the faint, shimmering outline of the man from the train hovering near Sarah. Nate then set the match to one of the torn mirror cloths he had just pulled down. The dry fabric caught fire with a whoosh, sending a sudden, intense burst of light through the suffocating darkness. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The room, once cloaked in shadows, was suddenly bathed in an unnatural, flickering light. And in that light, the man from the train was revealed for what it truly was. Not a solid figure, but a void. A gaping absence where a man should be. A living shadow, a monstrous outline of a form, flickering and unstable. It was an emptiness. A shape carved from fear and hidden truths. The entity recoiled, a silent, sickening motion. The intense light, the sudden illumination, seemed to scorch it. It writhed, its shadowy form shrinking, contorting as if it were trying to flee from its own revelation. The axe, an extension of its being, shimmered and faded. The light intensified as the other cloths, and then parts of the old, dusty attic itself caught fire. Flames licked up the walls, illuminating every dark corner. The heat became unbearable, the smoke choking. "It's a shadow!" Nate yelled, his voice echoing over the crackling flames. "It thrives on darkness, on secrets." Miller, seeing his savior disintegrate before his eyes, screamed in rage and disbelief. "No, you fool! You've destroyed our salvation!" He lunged at Nate, axe raised, but the flames were already consuming the makeshift altar, his vision obscured by smoke. In the ensuing chaos, the cultists, their belief shattered, panicked, and tried to flee the inferno. Some were trampled in the desperate rush, others overcome by smoke. Elias, his strength renewed by the sight of the monster's destruction, managed to untie Sarah and shield her from the smoke and flames. Nate, with a primal roar, tackled Miller, sending the judge and his axe clattering to the floor. The fight was quick, brutal. Nate, fueled by years of pent-up anger and the desperate need to save the child, delivered a series of sharp, precise blows learned in his Pinkerton days. Miller, disoriented and enraged, was no match for him. He fell, unconscious, into the rapidly spreading flames. "Nate! The child!" Elias yelled, pulling Sarah towards the attic door, which was already partly engulfed. The man from the train, now a mere wisp of smoke, a final, fading shadow, dissolved completely, vanishing into the inferno as if it had never been. It was not slain, but unmade, its illusion shattered by the light and the truth. Nate grabbed Sarah from Elias, her small body trembling against his. Elias, coughing, pointed to a collapsing beam. "We have to go, now!" They stumbled down the burning stairs, the heat searing, the smoke blinding. Nate shielded Sarah with his own body, his focus entirely on getting her out. Elias, injured but resolute, helped guide them through the collapsing house. They burst out into the night, gasping for breath, collapsing onto the overgrown lawn as the Moore house, the source of so much pain and darkness, became a raging inferno, lighting up the terrified faces of the gathered townsfolk. In the aftermath, the fire department, once a symbol of Villisca's civic pride, fought a losing battle against the blaze. The Moore house, that cursed monument to an unsolved horror, burned to the ground. Sarah was reunited with her hysterical parents, unharmed, a silent testament to Nate's intervention. Judge Miller and the remaining members of his twisted cult were arrested, their faces grim and defeated in the harsh light of the morning. Elias, bruised and burned, but with a flicker of hope in his eyes, confessed his involvement, his desperation, and his ultimate betrayal. He would face justice, but he had atoned, in his own way, by helping Nate. Nate sat on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the smoldering ruins of the Moore house. He hadn't solved the 1,912 murders. The identity of the original killer remained a mystery, shrouded in the ashes of the past. But he had broken the curse. He had exposed the human evil that had festered in Villisca, and in doing so, had banished the supernatural entity that fed on it. He had once been a man of pure logic, believing that every puzzle had a rational solution. Villisca had shattered that belief. He had confronted something that defied logic, an entity born of collective fear and unacknowledged darkness. He had won not by fighting it, but by exposing it, by bringing light to its hidden nature. As the sun rose higher, casting a new, hopeful glow over Villisca, Nate prepared to leave. He looked at Elias, who stood with his wife and their pale, but now recovering son. "You saved him, Elias," Nate said, a rare warmth in his voice. "Not with a sacrifice, but with courage." Elias nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Nate, for everything." Nate boarded the eastbound train, leaving Villisca for the second and final time. The town was scarred, forced to confront the terrible truth that its greatest monster hadn't been a spectral killer, but the darkness born from its own secrets, its own fears, and the twisted ideology of desperate men. The horror of 1,912 would forever be a part of its history, but perhaps now, a different story could begin. A story of healing, of truth, and of light. And Nate Crow, the broken detective, felt a faint stir of something he hadn't felt in years, a fragile, tentative hope for his own redemption.